It started as a normal night. The house was quiet, and the baby monitor on my nightstand emitted the soft static that had become a comforting background noise. My 6-month-old daughter, Emma, had been a little fussy earlier, but she'd finally fallen asleep. I was relieved. Her cries had worn me out. I was about to turn off the light and get some much-needed rest when I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, blending with the static, but then it grew clearer. "Hush now," the voice whispered, low and raspy. "Go to sleep." My body froze. I stared at the monitor, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought maybe it was picking up interference. Sometimes baby monitors catch stray signals from other devices, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The voice sounded too close, too personal, like it was in the same room as my daughter. I grabbed the monitor and held it closer to my ear. There was a long silence, broken only by Emma's soft breathing. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, but then the voice came again, sharper this time. "You're not alone, little one." The air felt heavy, like the walls were pressing in on me. My throat tightened, and I could barely breathe. I wanted to rush into Emma's room, to scoop her up and run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the bed. Summoning every ounce of courage, I finally bolted out of my room and down the hall. The baby monitor crackled as I moved, the static hissing louder with each step. Emma's door was slightly ajar, and the faint glow of her nightlight spilled into the hallway. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking. The room was cold, unnaturally cold. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Emma lay in her crib, sound asleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Relief flooded over me for a moment, but then I noticed the rocking chair in the corner. It was moving, back and forth, as if someone were sitting in it. But the chair was empty. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself to step closer. That's when I heard the voice again, clearer than ever. "You shouldn't have come." The chair stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I reached for Emma, but as I lifted her from the crib, the monitor in my pocket let out an ear-piercing screech. I fumbled to turn it off, but the voice cut through the noise, louder now, angrier. "She's mine." The room seemed to darken, the shadows stretching across the walls like they were alive. I clutched Emma tightly, backing toward the door. As I reached the hallway, the door slammed shut behind me, shaking the walls. Emma woke up screaming, her cries piercing through the thick, suffocating air. I ran to the living room and didn't stop until I was outside, shivering in the night air. I called the police, but they found nothing. No signs of anyone in the house. No explanation for the cold or the slamming door. We never went back. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that house again. But even now, when Emma is sound asleep, I sometimes hear it. Faint static and a whisper like it's still looking for her. It started as an ordinary evening. I had just finished work and was walking home through the quiet streets of my neighborhood. The sun had set, and the only light came from the occasional flicker of a street lamp. The cool air carried a faint scent of damp leaves, and the world seemed unusually still. I don't know when I first noticed it. Maybe it was a subtle shift in the air, a prickle at the back of my neck, or the faint sound of footsteps that always seemed to match mine. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I stopped walking and turned around, expecting to see an empty sidewalk. But there was something there. It was faint, just a shadow, but it didn't belong to anything. There was no one behind me, no tree or post to cast it, just a long, dark figure stretching across the pavement. It didn't move when I did. It stood still, waiting, like it was watching me. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself, picking up my pace. The sound of my own voice felt too loud, too real. But no matter how fast I walked, the shadows seemed to keep up, lingering at the edge of my vision. I didn't dare look back again. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it to catch my breath. The silence inside was heavy, almost suffocating. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. But that night, things got worse. I was brushing my teeth when I saw it again. The mirror over the sink reflected the shadow, standing in the corner of the room. It wasn't connected to me or anything else, just a dark, motionless figure. My heart pounded as I spun around, but the corner was empty. The shadow was gone. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the building made my skin crawl. I could feel it, even if I couldn't see it. Something was there, watching. The next morning, I told myself it had to be stress, or maybe I was just overtired. But as the day went on, the feeling didn't go away. At work, I caught glimpses of it in the corner of my eye, a dark blur that vanished when I turned my head. In the break room, the coffee pot cast a shadow that didn't match its shape. I couldn't escape it. That evening, I locked every door and window in my apartment, drawing the curtains tightly shut. I turned on every light, hoping the brightness would keep it away. But shadows still formed in the corners, darker and heavier than they should have been. When I finally crawled into bed, I told myself I'd call someone in the morning, maybe a doctor or a priest. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I felt it. A weight pressed down on the edge of my bed. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my head. The shadow was there, sitting at the foot of the bed, its empty eyes staring right at me. It didn't move, but the room felt colder, darker, as if it was pulling all the light and warmth into itself. I couldn't scream. I couldn't run. All I could do was close my eyes and pray it would go away, but it never did. I found the mirror at an old thrift shop on the edge of town. It was tall, with an ornate silver frame that caught my eye the moment I walked in. Something about it felt special, like it had been waiting for me. The shop owner seemed eager to sell it, almost too eager. But I didn't care. It was beautiful, and it was mine. I brought it home and placed it in my bedroom, leaning it against the wall across from my bed. That first night, I couldn't stop looking at it. The glass was so clear, so perfect, it almost seemed alive. I went to bed feeling strangely uneasy, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Around midnight, I woke up with a start. My room was pitch dark except for the faint glow of moonlight spilling in through the curtains. At first, I didn't know why I'd woken up. Then I saw it, the reflection in the mirror. It was me, sitting up in bed, but something wasn't right. My reflection wasn't moving. I blinked, hoping I was imagining things, but my reflection just stared back at me, its eyes wide and unblinking. My breath caught in my throat. I waved my hand slowly, and finally, the reflection mimicked me, though it felt delayed, almost reluctant. My heart raced as I turned on the bedside lamp, casting light across the room. Everything looked normal again. The reflection moved as it should. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. I was just tired. The next day I tried not to think about it, but that night the unease returned. I couldn't sleep, knowing the mirror was there, watching. At some point, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. When I woke up, it was to the sound of soft tapping. My eyes snapped open and I saw my reflection again. This time, it wasn't even in bed. It was standing in front of the mirror, staring at me with a twisted grin. I froze, unable to move or scream. Slowly, the figure in the mirror raised a hand and placed it against the glass. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, as if it was trying to break through. I scrambled out of bed, my legs shaking, and ran to turn on the overhead light. The reflection was gone. Just me again, pale and terrified, staring back at myself. I tried to convince myself I was dreaming, but every night, it got worse. The reflection didn't just stare anymore. It moved on its own, sometimes pacing, sometimes pointing at me. I started covering the mirror with a blanket, but I could still hear the tapping, faint but relentless, as if it was calling me. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the mirror and dragged it into the garage, throwing a sheet over it. I thought I'd finally be free, but that night, I woke up to find the mirror back in my room, leaning against the wall as if it had never left. This time, the reflection wasn't mine at all. It was something else, tall, shadowy, and faceless. It reached out from the glass, its fingers stretching toward me. I screamed and ran, but no matter where I went, the mirror was there, waiting. I don't know how to escape it. Even now, I can feel its presence behind me, the faint tapping growing louder. When I look in the mirror, I see more than my reflection. I see my end. When I moved into the tiny apartment, I was relieved to finally have my own space. It was old and creaky, but the rent was cheap, and the landlord had assured me that my roommate was quiet and kept to herself. Her name was Sarah, and she worked night shifts, so I rarely saw her. It seemed like the perfect arrangement. The first night, I noticed little things. The bathroom door would creak open on its own, and I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway. I brushed it off as the quirks of an old building. But when I went to bed, I could have sworn I heard whispering. It was so soft, almost like a breeze through the window. I told myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I left a note on the fridge for Sarah, introducing myself and inviting her to grab coffee when she had time. When I came home later, the note was gone, but she hadn't left a reply. Instead, there was something strange. A faint smudge on the fridge door, almost like a handprint, but too small to be hers. I told myself I was overthinking things. Maybe she wiped it off by accident. Over the next few days, the weirdness grew. I'd wake up to the sound of shuffling in the kitchen. But when I checked, it was empty. Lights flickered without reason, and my things started moving. My phone, my keys, small stuff I knew I'd left in one place but would find somewhere else. I tried to tell myself it was just Sarah being careless, but I hadn't seen her once. Not even a glimpse. One night, I decided to wait up for her. I sat in the living room with a book, listening to the silence of the apartment. Hours passed. Just as I was about to give up and go to bed, I heard the front door creak open. My heart raced. "Sarah?" I called out, but there was no reply. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate. I stood up, my hands trembling. "Sarah, is that you?" Still nothing. I moved toward the hallway, the dim light from the living room barely cutting through the shadows. As I turned the corner, the footsteps stopped. The hallway was empty. Then I saw it. Her door was slightly ajar and I could see someone inside. A figure standing with their back to me. Their head was tilted unnaturally to the side, and their arms hung limp. "Sarah?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure turned slowly. Too slowly. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't anyone I recognized. Its face was pale, hollow, and wrong. Its eyes were black voids, and its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. My breath caught in my throat as it took a step toward me. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and fell hard to the floor. When I looked up, the figure was gone. The door was shut, and the hallway was silent again. The next day, I packed my things and left. I couldn't stay there another night. As I handed the keys back to the landlord, I mentioned Sarah, hoping for some explanation. The landlord frowned. "Sarah? No one's lived there for years. To this day, I still hear faint whispers at night as if she followed me." It was late, and the office building was eerily quiet. I had stayed back to finish a project, and by the time I packed up, it was well past midnight. The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered as I made my way to the elevator. The air felt heavy, and every sound seemed amplified. The echo of my footsteps, the rustle of my jacket, even the faint hum of the vending machine down the hall. When I pressed the button for the elevator, I noticed the panel was smeared with what looked like a dark, sticky substance. I wiped my hand on my pants, feeling a wave of unease. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open with a metallic groan. I stepped inside, the stale air making my stomach churn. As the doors closed, I reached for the button for the ground floor, but before I could press it, the elevator jolted slightly, like something heavy had shifted. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Slowly, I turned to look at the mirrored walls behind me. My reflection stared back, tired and pale. But then, something else caught my eye. In the far corner of the elevator, there was a shadow, small, faint, but definitely there. I whipped around, but the corner was empty. My heart raced, and I tried to convince myself it was just the poor lighting. I pressed the button for the ground floor, eager to leave. The elevator began its descent, the hum of the machinery oddly loud in the silence. As we passed the third floor, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the elevator into darkness. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, I heard it. A faint whisper, low and guttural, coming from the corner where I'd seen the shadow. "You're not alone." The words were barely audible, but they sent chills racing through my body. I pressed myself against the cold metal wall, fumbling for the emergency button. My fingers trembled as I pushed it, but nothing happened. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The elevator jolted again, and I felt something brush against my leg. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my ears. The dim emergency light flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glow across the small space. That's when I saw it. The shadow in the corner wasn't just a trick of the light. It was moving, growing, taking shape. A figure emerged, thin, with elongated limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp, uneven teeth. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed as the thing leaned closer, its breath cold against my face. "You shouldn't have stayed late," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. The elevator shuddered, and the lights came back on. The figure was gone, but the corner where it had been was smeared with dark streaks, like something had clawed its way out. The elevator doors slid open, and I stumbled out into the lobby, gasping for air. The security guard looked up from his desk, startled. "Are you okay?" he asked, but I couldn't speak. I just ran, leaving my bag and everything else behind. I haven't gone back to that building since, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear that whisper in my dreams. "You're not alone." I moved into the old apartment building in the middle of winter. It was cheap, quiet, and close to work, but the hallways were always cold, no matter how high I turned up the heat. The building smelled of dust and dampness, and most of the tenants kept to themselves. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. My unit was at the very end of a long hallway. There were only 2 other apartments on my floor, and I rarely saw the neighbors. But from the moment I moved in, I felt uneasy. It was subtle at first, a strange feeling, like someone was watching me whenever I walked down the hall. One night, as I was coming home from work, I noticed her. An old woman stood at the far end of the hallway, just outside the last door. She was small and hunched, wearing a faded dress that looked decades out of style. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and sunken. She didn't say anything, just stared at me with a strange, fixed expression. "Hello?" I said, my voice echoing in the empty hall. She didn't respond, didn't even blink. I hurried past her, fumbling with my keys as I unlocked my door. When I glanced back before closing it, she was gone. I told myself she was just a neighbor, maybe a bit odd but harmless. Still, that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her eyes, how they didn't seem to look at me, but through me. The air in my apartment felt colder than usual, and the sound of the radiator clicking seemed louder than ever. The next morning I decided to ask the landlord about her. He gave me a puzzled look. "There's no old woman living on your floor," he said. "Just you and the couple in 2B. I felt a chill creep up my spine. "Maybe you saw a visitor," he added, shrugging it off. But I knew what I saw, and over the next few days, I kept seeing her. She was always at the end of the hallway, standing still, watching me. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye as I left my apartment. Other times I'd hear soft, shuffling footsteps in the night, even though I knew no one else was out there. One evening, I decided to confront her. I waited by my door, listening for the faint sound of movement. When I heard it, I stepped into the hallway. She was there, closer this time, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound brave even though my voice trembled. "What do you want?" She smiled then, a thin, eerie smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice dry and brittle, like leaves crunching underfoot. Then she turned and walked toward the last door, disappearing into the shadows. I ran back inside and locked the door, my hands shaking. That night I couldn't sleep. I felt like someone was standing just outside my bedroom door, waiting. The next morning I packed my things and left the apartment for good. I never went back, but sometimes I dream of that hallway, of her pale face and hollow eyes. And in every dream, she's closer, her whisper echoing in my mind. "You shouldn't be here." The attic had always been off limits, a place my parents warned me to stay away from. It was dark, dusty, and full of forgotten things. But when the storm knocked out the power one night, I found myself drawn to it. The flickering candle in my hand barely lit the narrow stairs as I climbed up, the creaks under my feet echoing through the silence of the house. When I reached the top, the door to the attic was slightly open, as if it had been waiting for me. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat, but curiosity pushed me forward. I stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and something faintly sweet, like rotting flowers. The attic was filled with old furniture, trunks, and boxes covered in cobwebs. My candle's light danced on the walls, casting strange, shifting shadows. As I moved deeper into the room, my foot kicked something on the floor. It rolled, hitting the leg of a chair with a hollow thud. It was a doll. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, a porcelain face, faded dress, and a tangled mess of hair. But when I bent down to pick it up, I noticed its eyes. They were glassy and dark, but they seemed too alive, as if they were watching me. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly set it back on the floor. Something about the doll felt wrong, but I couldn't look away. The longer I stared, the more it seemed to change. Its smile, faint and innocent at first, grew wider, its lips curling unnaturally. I backed away, clutching the candle so tightly my knuckles turned white. The shadows in the room began to shift again, but this time, they weren't random. They were moving toward me. A faint giggle echoed through the attic, high-pitched and childlike. My heart stopped. The doll's head tilted slightly, its glassy eyes now fixed directly on me. I froze, unable to breathe, as the giggle turned into a low, raspy whisper. "Don't leave me." I dropped the candle. The flame sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward, tripping over a box and falling hard onto the floor. I scrambled to my feet, desperate to find the stairs, but the whisper came again, louder this time, closer. "Stay and play." I felt something cold brush against my ankle, like tiny fingers. I screamed, kicking wildly, and bolted for the door. My hands fumbled for the knob, my fingers slick with sweat. When I finally wrenched it open, I didn't dare look back. I ran down the stairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. I slammed the attic door shut and leaned against it, gasping for air. But the giggle came again, muffled now but unmistakable. I locked the door and backed away, my eyes never leaving it. The next morning, I told my parents about the doll, about the whispers and the laughter. They exchanged a look, one that made my stomach churn. My mom finally said, "We never put a doll in the attic. I haven't gone back up there since. But sometimes late at night, I hear faint footsteps above my room, and every now and then the sound of a child's giggle drifts down the stairs." It started on a stormy night. The power had flickered on and off all evening, but I didn't think much of it. I was alone in the house, curled up on the couch, scrolling through my phone. The TV was on, playing some random show I wasn't really paying attention to. The rain lashed against the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Then the power went out completely. The sudden darkness was suffocating, and the silence that followed made my skin crawl. I sat there waiting for the lights to come back on. After what felt like an eternity, the power returned, but something was off. The TV screen flickered, showing static instead of the show I'd been watching. I grabbed the remote and tried changing the channel, but nothing happened. The static remained, crackling softly in the quiet room. I got up to unplug the TV, thinking maybe it needed to reset. But as I approached, the static began to shift. Shapes started to form, like shadows moving within the screen. I froze. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But then I saw it. A face, faint and distorted, staring back at me from the static. It wasn't my reflection. The face was pale, with hollow eyes and a mouth that twisted into a crooked smile. My heart pounded as I took a step back. The face moved closer, pressing against the inside of the screen, as if it were trying to get out. I couldn't look away. The more I stared, the clearer it became. It wasn't just a face. It was watching me. Its empty eyes seemed to follow my every move. My throat felt dry and my legs trembled, but I managed to turn and run to the kitchen, grabbing my phone to call someone. Anyone. There was no signal. Behind me, I heard the faint crackle of the TV. The static had grown louder, like a swarm of angry bees. Then, the whispering started. Low and raspy, it sounded like 100 voices all speaking at once, their words blending together in a horrifying hum. I crept back to the living room, my hands shaking. The face was still there, but now it was smiling wider, its grin stretching unnaturally across its face. "You're alone," it said, the words crackling through the static. I screamed and threw the remote at the TV, shattering the screen. For a moment, everything went silent. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. From behind me, I heard a soft laugh, high-pitched and chilling. I spun around, but there was no one there. The air felt heavy, and a cold breeze brushed past me, though the windows were shut. I backed away, tripping over the coffee table and falling to the floor. The room was dark now, except for the faint glow from the broken TV. The static was gone, but the face wasn't. It lingered in the shattered glass, its empty eyes locked on mine. "You can't turn me off," it whispered. I bolted out of the house, not stopping until I was on the street. To this day, I don't know what I saw or how it got there. The TV was gone when I returned with a friend the next morning, but sometimes late at night, I hear static in the silence and wonder if it's waiting for me to look again. When we moved into the old house, I didn't think much of the creaky floors or the way the wind seemed to whistle through the cracks in the walls. It had charm, my mom said, a little fixer-upper. But there was one thing about my room that I couldn't shake: the closet door. It never stayed shut. At first, I thought it was the house settling, or maybe the door frame was crooked. Every night before bed, I'd close it firmly, even wedging a chair against it. But by morning, the door would be open just a crack, dark shadows spilling out into my room. I tried to ignore it. "It's just a closet," I told myself. "There's nothing there." But the feeling wouldn't go away. Every night as I lay in bed, I could swear I heard something, a faint rustling like someone shifting inside. Sometimes I thought I could hear breathing, low and raspy. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I asked my mom if we could switch rooms. She laughed it off, saying I was too old to be scared of the dark. "There's nothing in there but your clothes," she said, ruffling my hair. I wanted to believe her, but deep down I knew better. That night, I decided to prove to myself there was nothing to fear. I pushed the chair back against the door, locking it in place, and climbed into bed. Hours passed, and the room grew colder, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and makes it hard to breathe. Then, I heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of the chair sliding across the floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked, slowly opening inch by inch. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. My eyes were locked on the dark sliver of space where the closet door had opened. At first, there was nothing, just shadows. Then, something moved. It was small at first, barely noticeable. A pale hand, bony and long, creeping around the edge of the door. My breath hitched as the hand gripped the doorframe, its nails clicking against the wood. Then came the face. It wasn't human. The eyes were too big, black and glistening, and the skin stretched too tight across its skull. Its mouth was wide, filled with sharp, uneven teeth, and it smiled at me, a horrible, knowing grin. "I've been waiting," it whispered, its voice high-pitched and breathy. I bolted upright, scrambling backward until I hit the wall. The thing crawled out of the closet, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a spider learning to walk. It stopped at the edge of my bed, tilting its head as if studying me. "Don't you want to play?" it asked, its grin stretching even wider. I don't know how I found the strength to move, but I leapt off the bed and ran, slamming the door behind me. My mom found me huddled in the hallway, shaking and crying. She didn't believe me, of course. Parents never do. The next morning, I found the closet door wide open again. This time, the chair was gone. I haven't slept in that room since, but sometimes, even now, I hear the faint sound of a door creaking open at night, and I know it's still waiting for me. It was late and the bus stop was deserted. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows across the empty pavement, and the air was cold enough to sting my cheeks. I clutched my bag tightly, checking the time on my phone. The last bus was supposed to arrive 10 minutes ago, but the road stretched on, dark and empty. I was about to call for a ride when I heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, echoing in the still night. I turned around, and there he was, a man standing a few feet away, dressed in a dark coat that hung loosely on his frame. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and there was something unsettling about the way he stood. Too still, like he was waiting for something. "Cold night, isn't it, Sarah?" he said, his voice low and raspy. My heart skipped a beat. He knew my name. I stared at him, trying to place his face, but I'd never seen him before. "How do you know my name?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, a faint smile creeping across his lips. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said. "It's not safe." Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice rising. He took a step closer, and I instinctively backed away. His eyes never left mine, and there was something about them, dark, empty, like looking into a void. "You'll find out soon enough," he whispered. I turned and started walking away, my pace quickening with every step. The bus stop was no longer an option. I just wanted to get out of there. But as I walked, I realized I could still hear his footsteps, steady and deliberate, following me. I broke into a run, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The street seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows growing darker. I glanced over my shoulder, and he was still there. Only now he was closer, his movements unnaturally smooth, as if he were gliding. I ran faster, my chest burning, but no matter how far I went, I could feel him behind me. Finally, I turned a corner and ducked into a small alley, pressing myself against the wall. My heart pounded in my ears and I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was silence, and I thought I'd lost him. But then, his voice echoed softly from the darkness. "You can't hide from me, Sarah." I felt a cold hand brush against my shoulder and I screamed, spinning around. But there was no one there. The alley was empty. My breathing was ragged, and tears streamed down my face as I stumbled out onto the main street. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment building. When I got inside, I locked the door and leaned against it, shaking. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out with trembling hands. There was a new message from an unknown number. It was just one sentence. "I told you it wasn't safe." I dropped the phone and backed away, my eyes darting to the windows. Outside, under the flickering streetlight, I saw him standing there, looking up at me, that same faint smile on his face. He raised a hand in a slow wave, and then he disappeared.